The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council looked exactly like what you'd expect from a bunch of aliens trying too hard to impress each other. Massive crystalline pillars stretched toward a dome that showed swirling nebulae because apparently every advanced civilization had the same interior decorator. The air hummed with the kind of self-important energy you'd find at a tech conference, where everyone pretends their startup will change the universe. Ambassador Krextall stood at the central podium, his reptilian scales practically glowing with smugness. He'd been practicing this speech for 3 standard cycles, and it showed. Every gesture was calculated, every pause dramatic enough to make Shakespeare weep. "Esteemed beings of the Galactic Council," Krextall began, his voice echoing through translation matrices in 17,000 languages. "Today we witness the unveiling of our greatest intellectual achievement." In the observation deck, Chief Analyst Vorthak clicked his mandibles nervously. The insectoid had spent the last 47 years studying what they called the Galactic Logic Grid, and he was absolutely certain that today would end in either triumph or species-wide humiliation. Possibly both. The massive holographic display materialized above the assembly floor. A 9x9 grid of squares filled with numbers and empty spaces floated in the air, rotating slowly like some kind of mathematical prayer wheel. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Several delegates from the emotional overflow sector started weeping tears of what might have been joy or terror. "Behold," Krextall announced, "the puzzle that has confounded our greatest minds for millennia, the challenge that separates true galactic intelligence from mere planetary cleverness." Down in the human section, which was basically a folding chair someone had wedged between the Andromedans and the vending machines, Jake Martinez took a sip of coffee from his thermos and squinted at the display. The coffee was terrible. Worse than airplane coffee, worse than gas station coffee. It tasted like someone had filtered it through disappointment and artificial vanilla. He'd been Earth's diplomatic representative for exactly 3 weeks, mostly because he'd filled out the wrong form at the unemployment office and nobody had bothered to correct the mistake. The job came with decent health insurance and the kind of travel opportunities that looked impressive on dating profiles, assuming you could explain why your last vacation was in the Horsehead Nebula. "The sacred logic grid," Krextall continued, warming up to his favorite topic, "represents the pinnacle of logical reasoning. Centuries of our finest scholars have dedicated their lives to its mysteries." Jake glanced around at the assembled aliens, all of whom seemed to be treating this grid thing like it was the Holy Grail, crossed with the meaning of life. He took another sip of cosmic disappointment coffee and wondered if the cafeteria sold anything that wouldn't actively insult his taste buds. Krextall gestured toward the floating grid with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts or really good pizza. "The Galactic Logic Grid has been the ultimate measure of cognitive superiority since the 3rd epoch of intellectual enlightenment. 27 major civilizations have declared it unsolvable. The Zephyrians spent 3 centuries on it before giving up and becoming professional musicians instead." Chief Analyst Vortex stood up in the technical section, his forearms trembling with excitement. "If I may elaborate, Ambassador Krextall," he buzzed through his translator, which made him sound like a caffeinated mosquito. "The grid operates on principles of numerical logic that challenge the very foundations of rational thought." The holographic display zoomed in, showing the 9x9 grid in excruciating detail. Some squares contained numbers from 1 to 9, while others remained tantalizingly empty. Vorthak's compound eyes gleamed as he began his prepared lecture. "Each horizontal row must contain the digits 1 through 9 exactly once," he announced, clicking his mandibles for emphasis. "Each vertical column must also contain these same digits exactly once. But here's where it becomes truly diabolical." He paused, letting the suspense build like a cooking show host about to reveal the secret ingredient. "The grid is divided into 9 smaller 3x3 boxes, and each of these must also contain the digits 1 through 9 exactly once. The complexity is staggering. The number of possible combinations exceeds the estimated number of atoms in several small galaxies." Jake yawned. He'd been up late trying to figure out his apartment's alien cable system, which apparently required a PhD in xenobiology just to find the sports channel. The grid looked familiar somehow, like something he'd seen before but couldn't quite place. "The Metallic Confederation of Rigel 7 devoted their entire educational system to grid studies," Vorthak continued, now fully in lecture mode. "Their greatest mathematical minds worked in shifts around their planet's clock cycles. After 200 standard years, they declared the challenge mathematically impossible and converted their research facilities into shopping centers. General Blurmax, a hulking creature that looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with a filing cabinet, leaned forward in his seat. My military strategists attempted to use quantum warfare algorithms on the grid. The computers achieved sentience just to tell us they quit. The assembled delegates murmured appreciatively. This was the kind of intellectual impossibility that made civilizations feel appropriately humble about their place in the universe. It was comforting to know that some challenges were simply beyond mortal comprehension. Jake raised his hand like he was in 7th grade math class. Excuse me, do you guys happen to have a pencil I could borrow? The entire assembly turned to stare at him. You could have heard a pin drop. If pins made noise in the vacuum of space, which they didn't, but the metaphor still worked, because the silence was that complete. Krextal's scales shifted to a confused shade of purple. I beg your pardon, Human Representative Martinez? A pencil, Jake repeated, making small writing motions with his hand. You know, for solving this thing. Also, is there any chance someone could fix the coffee situation? Because this stuff tastes like it was brewed in a gym sock. The silence stretched on like a particularly awkward elevator ride between floors 97 and 98. Finally, a small maintenance droid wheeled over and produced what could generously be called a writing implement. It looked like a glowing stick that someone had crossed with a laser pointer and a mood ring, but Jake figured it would work. Thank you, little guy, Jake said, accepting the alien pencil. He squinted at the holographic grid again, and something clicked in his brain like a rusty lock finally opening. Oh, wait a minute, this is just Sudoku. Krextal's head tilted so far to the side it was practically upside down. Sud what you? Sudoku, Jake said, already starting to fill in the obvious numbers. It's like a puzzle game. My grandmother does these things while watching soap operas. Pretty sure they print them in the newspaper right next to the crossword, and the horoscopes that tell you you're going to meet a tall, dark stranger who's probably your mailman. Chief Analyst Vorthak's compound eyes bulged so far out they looked like they might pop off and roll across the floor. Impossible. You cannot simply look at the sacred grid and immediately comprehend its mysteries. Jake filled in a 7 in the top right corner. Look, buddy, I'm not comprehending mysteries. I'm just putting numbers where they go. See, this row already has a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, so the missing spots have to be 7 and 9. And since this column already has a 9 down here, the 7 goes in this spot. The assembled delegates watched in horror as Jake worked through the puzzle with the kind of casual efficiency usually reserved for tying shoes or making toast. He filled in a 3, then a 5, then erased something, and corrected it to a 4. The pattern recognition is fairly straightforward, Jake continued, completely oblivious to the fact that several council members were hyperventilating into paper bags. You just look for the numbers that can only go in one place, fill those in, then repeat until you're done. It's like Sudoku for beginners, really. My nephew could probably solve this during commercial breaks. Vorthak's mandibles were clicking so rapidly they sounded like a broken printer. But the computational complexity, the astronomical number of permutations, the quantum probability matrices. Yeah, I don't know about all that, Jake said, filling in another number. I just see where the 6 can't go in this box because there's already a 6 in that row and there's already a 6 in this column, so it has to go right here. Pretty basic stuff. General Blurmack stood up so quickly his chair launched itself into the next dimension. You're using some kind of advanced human computation technology? No biological entity can process information at these speeds. Jake paused his pencil work to take another sip of terrible coffee. Dude, this is just pattern recognition. Like, have you ever tried to find matching socks in a dark laundry room? Same principle, except with numbers, instead of wondering why you own 17 single socks and no actual pairs. The sacred grid requires contemplation of infinite possibilities, Krextal protested, his scales now cycling through colors that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrum. Meditation upon the cosmic significance of numerical relationships. Sure, if you want to make it complicated, Jake said, filling in the last few squares. Or you could just remember that each number shows up once in each row, once in each column, and once in each little box. Pretty straightforward when you think about it. He set down the alien pencil and stretched. There you go, all done. Is there like a prize or something, or can I go find some real coffee? The completed grid hung in the air like an accusation. Every number sat in its proper place, mocking thousands of years of galactic intellectual tradition. For exactly 4.7 seconds, the universe's most advanced civilizations stared at a solved puzzle and questioned everything they thought they knew about existence. Then all hell broke loose. F-R-A-D! General Blurmax roared, pointing a massive claw at Jake. The human is using illegal cognitive enhancement technology. No natural brain can process the sacred grid's complexities. Now hold on, Jake said, raising his hands peacefully. I didn't use any technology. I just looked at the numbers and put them where they belonged. It's really not that complicated. Chief Analyst Vorthak had begun rocking back and forth in his chair, all 4 arms wrapped around his thorax. 47 years, he whispered. 47 years I've studied the fundamental impossibilities, the mathematical proofs, the theoretical frameworks that demonstrate why this cannot be solved. Maybe your math was wrong, Jake suggested helpfully. Vortek's rocking intensified. Wrong, wrong. I have 17 advanced degrees in applied impossibility studies. I wrote my dissertation on why the grid violates the basic principles of logical spacetime. Across the chamber, the delegate from the Melodic Wisdom Collective had started playing what sounded like a funeral dirge on his chest pipes. The crystalline representatives were flickering between colors so rapidly they looked like broken Christmas lights. And somewhere in the back, an entire row of bureaucratic Federation officials were frantically shredding documents that probably proved the grid was unsolvable. There must be an explanation, Krextall declared, though his voice had lost most of its earlier pompousness and now sounded like a deflating balloon. Humans, what is your species' average cranial capacity? I don't know, Jake admitted. Pretty average, I guess. We're not exactly the smart kids in Earth's class. Have you met dolphins? Those guys are really clever. We just have thumbs and a tendency to overthink things. Overthink? Vortak's voice cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. You solved the most complex puzzle in galactic history in 9 minutes and 17 seconds. And you call that overthinking? Jake shrugged. Well, I did spend a couple minutes wondering if I should start with the corners or work from the middle. But honestly, once you see the pattern, it's just filling in blanks. Like a really simple crossword puzzle, except with numbers instead of 5-letter word for disappointed. What, General Blurmax demanded, is a crossword puzzle? Oh, you guys don't have those either? Jake looked genuinely surprised. Huh. Well, it's like this grid thing, except you put words in instead of numbers, and they give you clues like large gray animal with trunk, and you write elephant. Pretty fun, actually. Good for passing time during long flights. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when someone drops a nuclear bomb on a library. Krextall's scales had turned a pale green that probably meant either nausea or existential crisis. Maybe both. You're telling us, he said slowly, that your species has multiple forms of these logical puzzles? Oh, sure, Jake said cheerfully. Crosswords, word searches, jigsaw puzzles, logic puzzles, those weird number pyramid things. My mom does cryptograms every morning with her coffee. Way better coffee than whatever you guys are serving, by the way. Vorthak made a sound that his translator couldn't process, probably because it was the audio equivalent of a system crash. Multiple forms, he repeated faintly. Multiple forms. Yeah, and some of them are actually challenging, Jake continued, apparently determined to destroy every alien sense of intellectual superiority. This Sudoku thing is pretty basic. Newspapers usually rate them from 1 star to 5 stars for difficulty. This one's maybe a 2-star, 3 at most. General Blurmax had started pacing in tight circles, his massive frame making the floor vibrate. The human claims this is a simple puzzle. The human claims there are more difficult versions. The human claims his offspring could solve our greatest intellectual achievement during television advertisements. Commercial breaks, Jake corrected, and yeah, probably. Kids love this stuff, great for developing logical thinking skills. Some schools use them in math class. That was apparently the final straw. 3 delegates from the philosophy sector fainted simultaneously. The emotional overflow representatives started wailing in harmonized despair. And Vorthak, brilliant chief analyst Vorthak, who had dedicated his entire existence to proving the grid's impossibility, slowly began banging his head against his datapad while muttering something about career changes and early retirement. Krextall was the first to recover from what historians would later call the great intellectual humbling of 2387. His scales had settled into a resigned shade of beige that matched his current emotional state perfectly. Human Representative Martinez, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, are you suggesting that your species possesses additional puzzles of greater complexity? Jake scratched his head, which made several delegates flinch like he was about to perform advanced calculus. Well, yeah. I mean, if you think this Sudoku thing is tough, you should see the New York Times Saturday crossword. That'll make you question your life choices. And don't even get me started on those 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzles with pictures of blue sky. Pure evil. A low moan emanated from the philosophical contemplation section. Someone was quietly sobbing in binary code. But surely, General Blurmack said, desperately grasping for some shred of galactic dignity, these are elite intellectual exercises reserved for your species' greatest minds? Not really, Jake replied, completely destroying any hope the general might have harbored. My neighbor Helen does the daily crossword every morning while waiting for her toast. She's 73, and her biggest intellectual challenge is usually remembering where she put her reading glasses. Nice lady, though. Makes excellent banana bread. Vorthak had stopped banging his head and was now staring at the solved grid with the kind of hollow expression usually reserved for people who just learned their entire life's work was pointless. 73 rotations around your star, he mumbled, doing puzzles, while preparing bread, from fruit. Oh, and there's Wordle, Jake continued, apparently determined to finish what he'd started. That's this word game where you get 6 tries to guess a 5-letter word. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. People get absolutely obsessed with it. My sister sends me her results every single day. Every single day. Along with commentary about how the word selection is getting ridiculous. Krextal was frantically taking notes on his diplomatic pad, probably trying to figure out how to spin this catastrophe to the Galactic High Command. This? Wordle? Is it more challenging than the sacred grid? Depends on the day, Jake said thoughtfully. Sometimes they use words like pause, which are pretty straightforward. Other times they hit you with something like fjord, and you spend 20 minutes staring at your phone wondering if that's even a real word. What? Asked a small voice from the timid species corner. Is a fjord? It's like a really dramatic bay with trust issues, Jake explained. Norway's got tons of them, beautiful but geographically complicated. Kind of like this whole situation, actually. The comparison to their current predicament seemed to break something fundamental in the collective alien psyche. The delegation from the Mathematical Certainty Consortium had begun constructing what appeared to be a fort out of their desk furniture. The Logical Purity Alliance was holding an emergency session that mostly involved groups screaming. Human Martinez, Krextal said, his diplomatic training finally kicking in. Perhaps we should discuss the implications of your species' puzzle-solving capabilities in a more private setting. Sure, but first, could someone please explain IKEA instruction manuals to them? Jake asked, gesturing toward the assembled crowd. Because if they think Sudoku is impossible, those Swedish furniture diagrams will probably cause a galactic mental health crisis. Vorthak stopped his muttering long enough to ask, what is an IKEA? Oh, it's this furniture store where they give you a box of wooden pieces and a diagram that looks like it was designed by someone who speaks only in pictographs and has never actually seen furniture, Jake explained cheerfully. You're supposed to build a bookshelf, but somehow you end up with 3 extra screws, a deep philosophical question about the nature of reality, and something that might be a chair if you squint and don't think too hard about structural integrity. The sound that emerged from the assembly hall was like 1,000 civilizations simultaneously realizing they'd been intellectually outclassed by a species that struggled with furniture assembly. It was not a dignified sound. General Blurmax raised a trembling appendage. Are these IKEA instructions more challenging than the sacred grid? Jake considered this seriously. Well, nobody's ever died from Sudoku, he said finally. IKEA instructions, on the other hand, have probably ended more relationships than infidelity and reality television combined. So yeah, I'd say they're definitely harder. And that was when the Galactic Council's emergency mental health protocols activated automatically. 3 standard hours later, after the medical teams had administered enough sedatives to tranquilize a small moon and the philosophy sector had been temporarily relocated to a nice quiet room with soft padding, the Galactic Council reconvened for what Krextal diplomatically called crisis management discussions. Jake sat in the same folding chair, now nursing his 4th cup of coffee that somehow tasted even worse than the first 3. He'd started to suspect they were actively trying to make it terrible, like some kind of cosmic practical joke. Human Representative Martinez, Krextal began, his scales now a steady gray that suggested either acceptance or complete emotional shutdown. The Council has reached a unanimous decision regarding Earth's new status in the galactic hierarchy. Cool, Jake said, not really paying attention, because he'd discovered that if he held his coffee at exactly the right angle, it reflected the chamber's lighting in a way that looked like a tiny rainbow. What's the verdict? Effective immediately, your species is hereby designated as Keeper of Sacred Numerical Mysteries. Krextal announced with the enthusiasm of someone reading terms and conditions. Earth is elevated to puzzle overlord status with full authority over all logic-based challenges within Council jurisdiction. Jake looked up from his rainbow coffee discovery. Wait, what? I just solved a Sudoku. That doesn't make me a puzzle overlord. That makes me someone who occasionally does the puzzle page instead of reading actual news. Furthermore, Krextall continued, clearly reading from prepared remarks, the Council formally recognizes that human puzzle technology represents a clear and present danger to galactic intellectual stability. Chief Annalise Vorthak shuffled forward, looking like he'd aged several decades in the past few hours. His compound eyes had developed a nervous twitch that made him look like he was constantly winking. "We've prepared a new series of challenges to replace the sacred grid," he announced with all the enthusiasm of someone announcing their own execution. The holographic display flickered to life again, showing what was clearly just Sudoku with slightly different arrangements. One version had the boxes arranged in an L shape. Another had some squares colored purple. The third one was labeled Advanced Logic Matrix in very serious-looking fonts. "You just made more Sudoku puzzles," Jake observed. "No!" Vorthak protested, his mandibles clicking frantically. "These are entirely different logical constructs based on advanced mathematical principles that definitely aren't related to your primitive number games." Jake studied the displays. "This one's called Samurai Sudoku. This purple one looks like a variant with colored regions, and that last one is just 5 regular Sudoku puzzles connected together. I think I solved one of those last week while waiting for the subway." The sound Vortak made was probably his species' equivalent of a nervous breakdown, but it came out through the translator as aggressive static. General Blurmax stepped forward, his military bearing intact despite everything else falling apart around them. "The Council has also voted to classify all Earth puzzle materials as weapons of mass intellectual destruction. Crossword books, Sudoku collections, and especially these IKEA instructions are now banned from galactic space." "That seems a bit extreme," Jake said. "What about jigsaw puzzles? Those are pretty harmless, although I guess the ones with all blue sky pieces could be considered psychological warfare." Krextall quickly made a note on his pad. "Jigsaw puzzles are now also banned." "And what about word searches?" Another note. "Banned." "Rubik's Cubes." "What's a Rubik's Cube?" Jake opened his mouth to explain, then caught sight of Vorthak's twitching eyes and General Blurmax's increasingly panicked expression. "You know what? Let's just say all Earth puzzle games are off limits. Probably safer for everyone involved." The relief in the chamber was palpable. Several delegates visibly relaxed for the first time since Jake had casually destroyed their entire worldview. "Excellent," Krextall said, his scales brightening slightly. "Now, Human Martinez, as our new keeper of sacred numerical mysteries, you'll need to designate a successor for when your diplomatic term ends." Jake grinned, and somehow that grin contained all the mischief that had gotten humanity into this mess in the first place. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. My replacement is this woman named Linda from accounting. Really nice lady, makes killer brownies." "And her puzzle-solving capabilities?" "Well, she introduced me to this thing called Wordoku. It's like Sudoku, except instead of numbers you use letters to spell words. Completely changes the game." The emergency mental health protocols activated again, but this time Jake was pretty sure he heard them playing soft jazz music, which seemed like an improvement. He made a mental note to ask Linda to go easy on them when she arrived. Maybe start with the simple stuff, like 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzles or calculus. As the medical teams wheeled away another batch of overwhelmed delegates, Jake finally found a coffee machine that dispensed something that didn't taste like it had been filtered through existential dread. Sometimes being humanity's accidental representative had its perks, even if nobody would ever look at him the same way again.